Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Solgi Lim, and I'll be your moderator for today's town hall. I'm the Director of Admission at Williams and also a member of the Faculty Staff Experience Subcommittee on the Working Group for Returning in the Fall. Before we jump in, I wanted to just share some housekeeping details around logistics. So first, we'll work through all the questions that were submitted in advance through the form that was included in Danielle's email. And as we're talking through those questions, you can send in additional questions using the Q&A tool that should be, I think, on the bottom of your screen. And in the interest of getting to as many questions as possible, if you've already asked a question on the form, please don't ask it again in that Q&A, just so we can move through the questions as quickly as possible. We'll reserve the last 10 minutes of our session for raised hands. So if you want to voice a question using the raise hand function, please hold tight and we'll make sure to have time at the end for raised hands. And finally, I wanted to mention that we'll be recording this session and it'll be available online for a week or so after the session. And there will be another communication that goes out on how to access that. So if you have to hop off or if you have colleagues who couldn't join us today, you'll still be able to see the full session. So today's panelists, I want to introduce them really quickly. The two co-chairs of the working group are Bojana Mladenovic, Professor of Philosophy, and Fred Puttister, Vice President for Finance and Administration and Treasurer. Do you guys want to wave really quickly? Thank you. And then the five subcommittee chairs of the working group, who are Deb Flynn, Director of Medical Services and Chair of the Health and Safety Subcommittee, Temeskin Araya, Director of Dining Services and Chair of the Operations Subcommittee, Lisa Mellandy, Director of Athletics and Chair of the Student Experience Subcommittee, Lee Park, Professor of Chemistry and Chair of the Academic Experience Subcommittee, and finally Matt Sheehy, Associate Vice President for Finance and Chair of the Faculty Staff Experience Subcommittee. Before we jump into the questions, Fred, did you want to say a few words before we turn our attention to those questions?
Yeah, thank you, Sogi, and thanks for everyone for joining in. These are some great questions we got, and the panelists here will dive right into them in a minute. First, I want to say two things. First, Bojana and I have the titles of co-chairs, but everyone in this committee is really working hard to put together a plan that we can present to MAUD for a potential fall opening. So I just want to thank all the members of the committee who are working basically around the clock to not only answer your questions we're going to answer today, but also put together a plan which will give MAUD the opportunity to decide whether she wants to open the campus up in the fall. And the second thing I wanted to say is that while we're working very hard on all the questions you posed and others that maybe you didn't pose, and we'll have many of those answers today. As we go through, you'll see we've thought about a lot of the things that are on your mind. There are some things that are still in flux. There are things we know we must have and we will have. Things like a robust testing program to test people for COVID and contact tracing for those that are do test positive. Things, sort of personal behavior things like wearing masks, social distancing, extra cleaning by facilities, staff, and personal hygiene that we'll all have to sort of abide by, like washing our hands a lot. These are all things that are going to be part of our lives come the fall, and they will have them in place. But there are other things that we're still working on, and certain things they remain uncertain and unknown. So while we're going to provide as much information as possible to you today, we appreciate your patience as we continue to work on the things we can't actually answer definitively today. So I just want to set the stage for, you're going to get a lot of answers, but there's going to be some cases where we just don't have the answer today, and we just beg your patience at this time. So that was it, Silgi.
Great, thanks, Fred. So we received nearly 60 questions through the form that could largely be organized into three main categories. One, around the timeline and process for returning to work should the college return to campus in the fall. Second, health and safety concerns and questions. And third, what I'm calling various HR questions and policy questions. And I thought we would move through them in that order. Because many folks ask similar questions, I won't read each of them verbatim, but instead I'll try to summarize them so that we can, again, get to as many questions as possible today and as thoroughly as possible. So I'll start off by asking, Fred, you touched upon this a little bit. What are some of the factors that will inform Maud's decision to return to campus this fall?
Thank you, Suki. That is a great question for Maud. No, now that's a great question. I think if you go back to Maud's letter back in March, when she made the decision to move students off campus, that the safety of everyone in our community is foremost on her mind. So that includes staff, faculty, students, and that'll be the main driver of any decision she makes. But I also think in coming back, we also have to make sure that we have activity on campus that would make it worthwhile coming back, and that obviously the number one priority there is academics and making sure the faculty can deliver the curriculum for students if they were to come back to campus. But there's a whole host of other co-curricular and extracurricular activities that make Williams what it is. And so the ability to deliver those programs, I think, will be another key factor in Maud's decision.
Great. The next question is, will the return to work on campus be in phases, or will everyone come back at once? This is actually a series of questions. Will this differ by department or within department, by staff role? How might we accommodate high-risk staff or those with caregiving responsibilities to those who are at high risk or with young school-aged children? And who will make these kinds of decisions for each department and for each staff member? It's kind of a long question. You can kind of take it piece by piece. And I'll ask Danielle and Matt to maybe tag team.
Thanks, Solgi. And I just want to say before I get into some of the nuts and bolts on these questions that there are a lot of, I recognize the subcommittee chairs are here, but there's a lot of people that are on the reopening plan committee, and we're just here representing all of those thoughts and the hard work that's going on by those particular groups. I just want to start at sort of a high level and recognize that a lot of the answers that we'll have about returning to work will be at a certain level, and then we are going to work with individual department heads, managers, and supervisors on a return to work plan framework that works for particular departments. We recognize, as you've probably read through some items and seen what other schools have done, you ask, what does that mean for me or my particular department? And we recognize that things will be inherently very situational to individual departments. And we have a return to work plan that was very, very close to being finalized that we're going to be prepared to launch and work with individual departmental managers on answering some of these very, very key questions. But the overarching concept that is going to be in that work plan is people are going to continue to work remotely if they can. The number one goal will be to de-densify campus so that those who do have to come to campus on a regular basis can do so knowing that interactions can be limited, and that we will continue to work in a fashion of limiting personal contact. So that's going to be the overarching plan framework. The framework will start with a baseline of assumptions around things which many people have questions about regarding travel and visitors, and we are going to recommend a number of those types of assumptions to Maud so that people do feel comfortable. So stay tuned. A very detailed work plan framework that asks a lot of these probing questions for each department is forthcoming. But Danielle, maybe you can talk about some of the specifics around employees and immunocompromised or caregiving issues.
Sure. As some folks may be aware, when we went into full response mode and we all left the campus, HR created a really streamlined process, and that basically by streamlined, as you just called us, and got on a list and said you were high risk, immune compromised, didn't have childcare, a host of factors, and then we just tracked them and worked with their supervisors to either accommodate, change schedules, or just stay at home and continue using the COVID pandemic earnings code for those who were out of work. So we're going to continue along those lines, but maybe make a little more of thoughtful, comprehensive process now, so that those folks on that list will kind of have to re-up their request following July 1. And it won't look a whole lot different, but we were also in the time where we knew no one could get medical documentation. No one could get into their doctor if they tried. So we waived all those requirements. So now it'll start to look a little more like the standard FMLA process to request anything around medical documentation and high risk factors. Of course, if it's just around age, and when we say high risk factors, we're looking at the CDC's definition of high risk factors. And we also know that childcare, whether that's after school care, what the schools do, what state you live in, is all a huge factor that we're going to have to consider. So there will be an option to suggest and say, I have lost my childcare or coverage due to COVID. And those folks, we will really, again, as Matt started off, the overarching theme, right, is to continue to work from home for jobs where that's feasible. There's some jobs where that's not feasible, and that's why we're going to help and work with those individuals one-on-one with different kinds of accommodations or flexible schedules. Again, it does become a bit department specific that will help out. But if somebody can just switch days off or a different shift, those might be alternatives to just, or it could just be a full leave arrangement in those cases. So we recognize that's a really challenging situation. If you don't have care for your children and you're at home, what work can be accomplished is a whole other scenario. Whether that's extended family you're caring for, or children in the home, there's lots of distractions. While this could be a welcome reprieve for some, it's difficult to get that normal amount of work done in those cases. So HR is working with managers on providing those supports of what it's like to manage a remote team and what might be different in these scenarios as we continue down this path for some time.
Great. Another question we got via the form is, will staff hours change if class hours change for students? And Lee, I know your team has been doing a ton of work trying to think through the course schedule. So maybe if you could start us off, and then Danielle, if you wanted to add anything.
So in thinking about what the class hour schedule will need to look like in the fall, one of the things that is going to change the class hour schedule is the need for longer passing periods between classes. So that is, we need to allot sufficient time for one group of students to, at the end of class, wipe down their areas, leave class, and then we want to leave the rooms empty for a certain period of time before the next group can come in. We also don't want the students to be bumping into each other in the corridors or the hallways, that kind of thing. So the class hour schedule that we've come up with accounts for a 30-minute break between the end of one class and the beginning of the next class. So currently, the current class hour schedule only has a 10-minute break. So that 30-minute break will allow for that passing period and, again, time for the room to sit empty. It'll also allow for the fact that students may be walking further across campus to get to all the different rooms that we're going to be using as classrooms. So once we do that, obviously that means that the class hour schedule will change a bit. So the class hour schedule that we have right now that we're proposing, this will be brought to the faculty on Wednesday, and we hope that the faculty will vote to accept this for the next academic year. It would start at 8 a.m. on Mondays, which is what our current schedule starts at, and it would run till about 4:40 p.m. in the afternoon. Our current schedule ends at 3:50, so it goes a little bit later in the afternoon. And then there are evening classes. So in our existing class hour schedule, we already have evening classes, and so we would have evening classes as well. And they cover about the same time period. So Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays would look very similar compared to in the new schedule relative to our existing schedule. Tuesdays and Thursdays would look a little different. We'd need to start a little bit earlier. We'd need to start at 8 a.m. rather than 8:30 a.m. And we have evening classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays as well. But largely the footprint is similar to our existing class hour schedule, but there are those changes.
I think the only thing really to add, one of the themes you might have already picked up on, or we've all been grappling with, is trying to be creative as possible as we adapt our work to this new environment. So I would say the short answer is it's certainly possible that some staffing schedules or needs might change and flux. Obviously, we are trying to be as flexible and creative respecting what people have as commitments in those ways and trying to give a heads up. You can only imagine what Temesgen is dealing with and trying to feed students in different models if they're here on campus with this new class schedule, whether we are de-densifying offices and someone's got an office suite mate that they've got a rotating schedule. Things are just going to be creative and a little different. So I think it is a possibility, but as Lee pointed out, there's some core framework that doesn't look dramatically different either. So I think it's sort of on the fringes, but a possibility to be open to.
Great. Another question is, can you work remotely from any location if you are working from home? Danielle, I'm going to kick this to you.
Yeah, this is a hot topic for sure. As folks might not be aware, this is a whole new level of remote work for Williams. We don't have a lot of this as part of our culture prior to COVID. We are authorized as an entity to do business in Massachusetts and in Connecticut because of our Williams Mystic program. That's where we pay our payroll taxes and unemployment, workers' comp, et cetera. So having individuals then working outside of those two states is problematic. And then clearly we sit on the border of Vermont and New York. So that in itself, then immediately we have people working from home in other states, right? The government, as you've seen, they've been pretty loose in extended tax deadlines. There's not been any federal or state declaration that this boundary has now become permeable, but people are trying to be more flexible. So Massachusetts has not made a specific statement themselves that they're being flexible, but under the advice of our general counsel, we're looking at this as that we are going to continue to be flexible in these arrangements for the duration of the summer, perhaps likely through the end of the calendar year, where people are working from is a more flexible thing. Obviously, as the more services that return to campus, more people will be coming to campus physically. So in the short term, we're trying to be flexible about this, maybe even medium term, but long term, it's not a sustainable thing because that's where our tax exempt status is in Massachusetts and Connecticut. So hopefully that makes sense.
Great. We're going to switch gears a little bit to health and safety, and there are a lot of questions and then I think a lot of components to the answers to these questions. So I'll start off with what kinds of safety measures will be put into place, and what will the college do if people don't follow safety guidelines? So I know a lot of folks in this group have actually been thinking about and working on this. So in no particular order, Deb, Temesgen, Matt, Danielle, I think at some point you guys will all need to chime in. Lee.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just kick it off with a sort of an overarching concept that I think will be recommended. And we have a draft of something we're calling a community public health commitment. And this is a commitment that faculty, staff, and students will all adhere to. And it really is a shared commitment. I think this idea of, we've heard words tossed around like mandate and enforce. I think really what we have to do is we have to commit to each other and our own public health. And how do we do that effectively as a community? And that's going to be the goal in the commitment, is for all of us being willing to say, whether to a supervisor or to a colleague or whatever might it be, hey, I saw something you were doing and it made me uncomfortable, or hey, can I remind you that the guidelines are X, Y, and Z, or I saw you, host this meeting and I'm uncomfortable with it. That's not following the guidelines. I think we all have to be comfortable with sort of human to human having those explanations, and we recognize we're going to learn from those experiences as well. So I think we're starting out with a commitment, and we are all going to work together in building this healthy community of living and working together at Williams. And I think that's going to be the tenet of that sort of provides a baseline for everything that you hear about with respect to safety measures. A number of the things that we're going to work through and assumptions and recommendations that you can expect that comes through this process is limitations on travel, limitations on visitors, controlling access to buildings. All of those things are going to be put in place as part of a recommendation for reopening in the fall. But as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of that is going to be situational and working through individual work plans with departments to think about those safety measures, because some of it is very inherent to individual office operations, office configurations, furniture, all of those types of things. And we're prepared to do that. And we have a framework for doing so. So I just wanted to start off with those underpinnings. And then I'm sure Deb can talk to us about some of the very specific health related items that we plan to implement.
Sure, thanks, Matt. So basically the commitment, I think what goes along with the commitment is the education behind it, right? What the expectations are in returning to campus. The 6-foot rule isn't going to go anywhere. Neither is the mask. So students are going to be expected to wear masks anytime they're outside of their room or their bathroom. They're going to be wearing masks in class. And same for the faculty and staff. When you're not in your own space where there's, where you're able to shut the door and be alone, then you're going to be expected to wear a mask and maintain social distancing. I think the community aspect of this is key. We're counting on everyone to follow through on the guidelines, because the consequences of not following through can be detrimental to a number of people. And I think what goes along behind that really is educating the students before they come back on what the expectations are going to be of them. And I think that's basically what I've got to say on that. Boyana?
Yeah, I just want to add that everybody is going to be tested before the campus opens. And then 7 to 10 days later, students are going to be tested again. Testing will be regularly at intervals we haven't determined yet. We need guidelines be happening throughout the semester. Anybody experiencing any symptoms consistent with COVID will be tested. And we are going to have in place the system of contact tracing and isolation. We are going to have the system of transportation for students who need to be seen in one of the local hospitals. So that side of things is going to be in place before we open, or we will not be able to open.
Yeah.
Sure, and I just want to highlight that there will be a number of safety measures, and once again, the work plans will be a part of this. A number of departments will be looking at the services that they can provide, and what are the most critical services that they provide, and how do we prioritize those. And some of that might come in the form of changes to some things that we typically do. Not to say that this is the case, but you could envision maybe the library isn't open as long because that's what we need to do as far as being able to clean the space or staff the space or things like that. So once again, working with individual departments is going to be really, really important in designing processes and procedures for how can we do this safely, how can we do it with staff and really understand those and sort of the staff constraints and staff needs. There will also be other things that we'll do from an overarching standpoint and start with. And reducing areas where there are common touch points, i.e. Office kitchenettes and places like that, places where multiple people are coming in and using the spaces. And so there will be guidelines around the use of those spaces and how they will operate to reduce contact and staff interactions or community interactions in those spaces. So we're thinking about all of those things, and we'll have clear-cut guidance for individual departments and offices on those types of situations.
Just wanted to add in and piggyback off of what Matt just mentioned is that we're preparing to make sure we have safety training on campus, virtual platform, to make sure anyone who hasn't been on campus and currently are on campus is going through a training course that will allow them to inform themselves and their colleagues in how to work safely when returning back to campus.
And I can't remember if this was already said or if we talked about it in other contexts, but PPE, the availability of it, who provides it, can somebody speak to that really quickly?
Sure. We will be providing all of the required PPE that folks will need. That primarily will come in the form of a fabric cloth face covering. We'll provide multiple to all faculty, staff, and students. We're in the process of procuring all of the other types of things that people would think about as part of creating a healthy work environment, from hand sanitizer to soap and those kinds of things. We're also doing assessments of individual bathrooms to see what sort of improvement needs to be made. There's a little bit of research out there about hand dryers and whether or not hand dryers are appropriate or not appropriate. So we're slowly working through that guidance and trying to determine what's going to make sense for our campus. But all PPE will be procured by the institution and provided to you as if you're reporting to campus and for your job. There is not an expectation that people will be bringing in their own. People obviously are more than welcome to use their own face coverings or things like that they would like to use, as opposed to the ones that are issued, but the college is prepared to issue all required PPE.
And Silgi, I would just add that it's also our intention to provide disposable masks at places where people gather, be it classrooms or the dining halls, because there are times when we just forget to bring our mask, and so there'll be an opportunity to be able to tell someone, hey, it looks like you forgot your mask today. Here's one you can take right now. Make it easy to have compliance.
Yep, and we just got a question through the Q&A about how we'll address folks who are not following guidelines. So Matt, you talked a little bit earlier about the commitment and then also the kinds of reactions and behaviors that we'll need to be prepared for. So could you just reiterate that really quick?
Danielle, can you take that one?
Yeah, I can. And I think it sort of intersects with another committee that I am part of, that is a communications working group related to planning for Maud's decision. I think there's a real sense of shared accountability that everyone's trying to create. And so, whether we're gonna have poster campaigns and PSA videos and those sorts of things, just to remind people, in many of our restrooms, there are still hand washing signs that are from like 1990, I think. So there'll be updated versions of those and just reminders like, do you have your face mask before you enter this space? So I think that will help. And we will have to come up with our own sort of common language of just a reminder. I mean, I'm sure if anyone's been out into the world, you see people's face masks that drop and their nose is sticking out, and how we just call each other out in those ways. Clearly as a staff matter, I mean, I hate to be this blunt about it, but if someone truly cannot comply, then that is a risk to the community, and there could be disciplinary action in those ways. I'm sure that would be similar on the student side. There obviously, no one wants to be the COVID police here, but there are things that we have to have as a safe employer and a safe community and safe working environment that we have as obligations. So we're going to have to work together to do that. So it's a very serious part of the communication effort that we're trying to do, and that Fred could give you a very detailed analysis of what the state dictated for construction sites. They actually dictated we had to have COVID officers in those cases. So, again, we don't want to tag it to one individual, but we all have to have that shared accountability.
And then one more clarifying question here. Boyana talked about testing for everybody. And the question was, who is everybody? Is it all students, faculty, and staff? Or could you just define that?
So yes, it is everybody. Go. Sorry, Fred.
No, go ahead. So we're going to provide testing for everyone. It may be that faculty and staff who have their own insurance and can get tests for free may choose to use their own private physicians to do that. But we'll have a testing program in place to provide testing for everyone who wants it.
Great. There was a question around whether departments will get guidance for how our use of physical spaces will change. We started to get at that a little bit. Is there anything that anyone wanted to add on that front?
I just want to go on and say that, and this is going to sound a bit repetitive, but those work plans will be really important. And the work plan will dive into those sort of individual spaces. Obviously, at sort of a broad level, we've started with classrooms so that we can answer questions about how will classrooms be used. But once again, this is going to be very situational to individual departments. We're really going to work with folks. And some of the conversation will say, how do we do business a little bit differently? If there's an opportunity, rather than making a physical change to a space, do we need to make an operational change to a business process to change the way that we may have done something in the past to accommodate this in the future? So we're prepared to have those conversations about, as I mentioned, kitchenettes, about shared office spaces and how do those work, and how do we work with individual managers, supervisors, department heads on thinking about scheduling of staff in those spaces, all of those kinds of things. And one overarching thing that I want to say is that, once again, this community about public health will also have to support our custodians and essential staff, and how do we maintain spaces. So there is going to be, in addition to PPE and other things, supplies provided so that you can wipe down a surface when you're done in a space. And an expectation that people will have that shared commitment to saying, hey, we just had a meeting in the space, or we just had an event in the space, we're wiping this space down. Not to say that it won't be cleaned again at some point later, but I think we're going to make that part of our daily routines. Is, you enter a space, you sanitize, you finish in a space, you sanitize, and the next person coming in is doing the exact same thing. So we'll all have to wear multiple hats and contribute in that fashion.
Yeah, I would just follow up to that. As Matt is right, the first thing we're thinking about is maybe we can just change the way we provide our services to the public. Danielle has talked about, at least for a period of time, having HR be not staffed fully, because she doesn't want all her staff in the office at the same time, and do other things by appointment. So think about it those ways. But if there's no way to reduce the risk by changing the process, we're prepared to make physical changes to our spaces if necessary. That's a commitment we have.
There was another question about whether there would be enhanced cleaning protocols and additional supplies available for spaces across campus, and especially those open 24/7. I think we've answered the question, which is yes. So I'll move on to whether staff might have access to on-campus medical resources. It's sort of a specific question, but wanted to make sure we didn't.
At this point, there's no thoughts about doing that. The health center is really a student health center, nor do we have the staff to take on faculty and staff as well. So at this point, no. There are other options. Berkshire Medical Center does have a COVID line that you can call. You get an RN will screen people for any symptoms, and they will set up testing if they feel that people fit the bill. You can also do telehealth through this COVID line if they decide that that's a necessary next step. The Blue Cross Blue Shield also has a well connection, which again is a phone consult that is no charge. So those are options that employees can use as well.
And Deb, another question here. Will Williams's community requirements always follow state guidelines?
Yes, state guidelines and the CDC will be driving our decisions medically. Yep.
Great. And then final question that we received in advance in this sort of health and safety realm. Will work or personal travel be allowed? And it's two separate things. So if folks want to tag team.
Matt and I can probably tag team this one a bit. We know that the state has really specific guidelines around a 14-day quarantine if you leave the state. So we are working on guidelines to help people think through this. It's a nuanced thing, particularly where we live, where you could probably go to some remote cabin in Lake George and not see a single soul, but you've crossed the state line. But driving into Boston seems like maybe a bad idea in a really populated area. And funny how COVID probably doesn't know where the state line is. So we want people to use good judgment, and when they're traveling or taking some downtime, to think about those things. If you're going to a really busy wedding full of people, then we would probably ask somebody to self-quarantine, right, upon their return from that event that they were at. But if you went to your family cabin and saw nobody else, that's a different scenario. And so that sounds really vague, and we get it. And we're going to be relying on management discretion and having really open conversations between staff and management about what their travel plans are. We don't want to be so rigid that no one will just bother telling us if you go out of town. Let's be real about it. So, it's really, we're trying to establish some guidelines that are reasonable. It's summer. Fortunately, we live in the most beautiful place and people come as a vacation destination. So hopefully you don't want to travel too far. But we know that there's some guidance around that would be helpful for folks, in particular, as we head into summer peak, what would be travel season normally. And then and maybe Matt, you can expand on that or talk more about work travel.
Yeah, so I think the recommendation at this point in time is to continue to adhere to the guidelines that MAUD had released, which suspends all work-related travel. We anticipate that that's going to continue for some period of time, but we also recognize this is an area where there is going to be some business that requires people to leave the area in order to fulfill the requirements of their job. And so once again, that's, as Danielle talked about on the personal side, is going to be a nuanced conversation with management. We will have an exception process for those for people to petition and say, this is really critical travel for X, Y, or Z reason. And we'll work through those. This is an area that we we anticipate that we are going to learn more as we begin to reopen and people begin to think about their individual operations. And so we will be flexible, but initially out of the gate, you can anticipate that the answer is going to be very little, zero travel, and then an exception process for work travel for department heads and managers and senior staff members to work through.
Great. We're going to switch gears a little bit now and get to the various HR questions. And I'll start with this one. So with the salary freeze in place, is there a way that the college will address the equity issue across staff, some of whom have increased workloads because of the pandemic, including due to hiring freezes, and others who might be working less or not at all, but still being paid a full salary? Danielle?
I guess I'll take that because I didn't see Fred jump off his unmute button. This has been obviously a difficult time for many. I look at this panel and these folks who've been working nonstop since most I see every morning at 8 a.m. since March 13th, I think. That when we think about equity in this conversation, it has been to preserve every job and sustain this community and keep people employed. Does that feel fair in the workload at the moment? Probably not to everybody, but that was the community commitment and what we really strive to do. So I think that that's the thing I would really want to impress upon people, that it was preserving all jobs and benefits and to preserve the community in that sense. We certainly saw in Dukes' announcement that there are no increases, no merit adjustments, no structural adjustments. We are asking managers, however, I'm going through the typical merit process of asking people to send me their recommendations so that we can capture those sentiments and hopefully recognize people in the future. And then I will just add anecdotally, I'm sure Fred has other comments, that if someone is taking on significant additional duties, particularly in a higher job grade because a position is held vacant, that's a different conversation. Those have been recognized in lots of different ways because some of those vacancies are being held for quite some time. And I'm empathetic in that. I have that happen in my own team right now. So, those are the overarching concerns as we thought about this for the community. Fred, if you have something else to add there.
Well, that was a point I was going to make. If someone is actually stepping in for someone who the position is vacant and has remained vacant because of the position freeze, that's a different situation. One of the most frustrating things, there's a lot of frustrating things about this whole process that I, as a manager, have experienced. And the most frustrating of them is not being able to compensate the people that work for me for all the extra work they're doing. But rest assured that through this kind of weird merit process we're going through this year, where we're recognizing those folks, and while we're not compensating them now, that is the goal when we come out of the financial piece of this, is to recognize them financially. So that will come. I can't guarantee when that'll happen, but when we have funds freed up and we think we're on a sounder financial basis to make those additional commitments, we will.
Great. Another question is there a plan to insulate staff from insurance premium increases or rent on college-owned properties, especially considering that salaries are flat this coming year?
Yeah, I'll take the first one and I'll hand the second one off to Matt. He manages our rental program. We don't know what the increase is going to be this year on health insurance. That determination is typically made late in the summer. Obviously, you've seen a bit of a dip in our medical expenses over the last couple of months because people can't get to the doctor, but that's, we think, short-lived. So we'll make that decision at the time. I can tell you in the past, when we've had large increases in health insurance, we've set a limit. I think it's in the $70,000 range of family income where we've protected people that were lower than that threshold from those increases until the salary increase can be implemented the following July. So that would be one thing we would consider with the health insurance. But Matt, do you want to handle the rental?
Sure. I think for those who are already in rental properties, the real estate office announced last month that we would not be increasing the payments or the rents for those particular properties in recognition of the fact that we anticipated flat salaries and things like that. And we'll continue to be cognizant of those types of things as we move forward where we do have those abilities.
Great, and I just wanted to remind everybody on the call that you can use the Q&A tool to send in questions or clarifying questions, comments, and then we'll leave 10 minutes at the end for folks to raise their hand and to be able to actually voice their questions. So just know that we'll get to you if you've been raising your hand for a while. Moving on, let's see, is there a plan to change the college's sick leave policy to better support staff during the pandemic?
We actually haven't had staff use any sick time during this period for anything particularly related to COVID. You would still use sick time if you had your own cold for the day, your child was sick, or a doctor's appointment. So we didn't see any motivations to change sick leave since that's pretty much intact. We actually have a really generous policy as compared to our peers with a cap at 80 days. And just not to get into the details, it's like a whole other webinar, but to remind folks that coming in January, leave benefits will be changing. So short-term disability will be paid at 100% for support staff. So even less sick time will be needed. The wait period will be shorter. So I think that we're actually institutionally in really good shape because anything related to COVID is going to be just tagged in as an earnings code as a COVID-related illness. So I think we're in good shape there. If someone has specific questions or a different scenario, should certainly reach out to HR or Megan or myself or Tammy.
And Danielle, can you answer this question that just came in via the Q&A? What kind of resources are available for staff around mental health support related to COVID or anxiety about returning to campus?
Sure. We certainly still have our employee assistance program that is available 24/7. And I know that Blue Cross Blue Shield has actually really been pushing that the telehealth, telemedicine is working with more mental health clinicians there. So there's both resources there. And as a reminder, if you go through our EAP visit, you get like your first 5 visits for free in those cases. But I think that's a really great question because there's a lot of people with varying levels of anxiety, whatever's going on in their house about what this is like right now. So we plan to do some discrete programming this summer and workshops, whether that's partnering with others on campus like IWS or just having some listening sessions. So that's on our radar as well.
Great, and Danielle, I'm going to keep throwing these questions at you. There's a question about whether the college might expand the vacation cap and whether the college might offer early retirement packages.
Sure, I'll start with the latter one because it's a little shorter. I know that question's come up for us a lot since that was done in 2008-9 in the last financial crisis. The ad hoc committee on financial planning that Duke's led did look at what that yielded when we did that, however, 10 plus years ago now. It yielded some minimal savings in the short term because we froze positions that were empty, but really within less than 3 years, everything had returned. So the committee deemed that this was not particularly an effective experiment that we did back then, and we would not be pursuing that as an option currently. I don't know that there's any more to add to that, Fred, but we certainly looked at it and said not right now.
Yeah, I would just add, you do those things to save money so you can protect more jobs. But in order to save money, that means we have to keep more positions vacant. And I think at this time, there's probably more places where we're understaffed than overstaffed. So I think it'll be counterproductive to eliminate more positions in order to save money in that type of program. So that's why we're not pursuing it.
Well said. The question about vacation, I think we recognize it's not an ideal time to take your dream vacation or hop on an airplane or travel somewhere. But we certainly are encouraging folks to take some downtime and to use their vacation. So, there has not been a discussion right now to raise the vacation caps.
Danielle, another question about whether there might be an option to work reduced hours for reduced pay.
That's an interesting offer. We haven't discussed that. I think we've been trying so hard to really get across that we're not looking at furloughs and layoffs, that opening those discussions would have been, I think, maybe stressful for folks and create more anxiety. If someone is particularly interested in that, I guess we would entertain that conversation, but it has not been a strategic approach we've been looking at to ask people to do. And I know some of our peers have done that, ask people to take like their own mini sabbatical or reduced hours as a short-term thing. As Fred said, there's so much work to be done. In some cases, it seems like a difficult thing to pose as an option.
And then finally, I know there have been some communications about this, but there was another question around whether the college can guarantee job security around salaries and benefits. Could you speak to that a little bit?
I'll take a shot at that, and then and I'll go back to Dukes's comments, both in his communications from the ad hoc committee and his the comments we had at town hall. That is the number one goal for us when it comes to staff, is to keep as many jobs as possible and not furlough people. And it's the number one priority. Some of our peer schools, the schools that are wealthy like us, like Swarthmore and others, are furloughing people. I mean, that's just something we prefer not to do, and we will do it only as a last resort. But with the markets being what they are and the college being over 50% dependent on our endowment draw and the volatility that's happening in the market right now, it's hard to guarantee anything, but the highest priority on the staff side is to maintain all our jobs, all our positions.
Great, thanks, Fred. There's a quick follow-up for Matt about housing. Would the college consider extending rental agreements for folks in college housing so they don't have to move during this period?
Not at this point in time, believe it or not. We just went through our lottery with respect to rental housing, and we have quite a few people moving into the area preparing for the academic term. I don't want to say that we'll never explore those options, but once again, looking at sort of equity across the entire balance of people who make use of that opportunity and that benefit, we just have to be cognizant of that. We are being flexible and working with people's individual circumstances within the current guidelines of the program. I think any changes that we make will seek a lot of input, particularly from our ad hoc real estate working group that has been instrumental in some of the changes that have been made. But at this point in time, we're not looking at extending those because we have just as many people moving in who are in similar situations and being cognizant of that.
Great, thank you. And before we shift to the hand raising, the live questions, Fred, two final questions for you. I'm going to throw both at you. You can answer them in whatever order you'd like. One is, what will the threshold and process be for another shutdown if we have to shut down again? And two, where does the endowment stand and how will that affect budget cuts and staffing plans?
So I'll take the second one first. The endowment is not where we expected it to be for the close of fiscal year 2020. This is something Abigail could answer much more succinctly than I, but a number of our investments are in what are called non-marketable securities. That is, they don't have a market price. So we only know their true value at the end of the fiscal year when the auditors do the audit of those securities. So I don't have a definitive answer today as to what the market value is today. So we'll know that sometime in late August when the audit gets finished. I can say, and you've probably seen this if you're watching the financial news, the markets are still quite volatile. While we have seen increases since the bottom back in March and early April, just last week, the market went down 6% in one day. So that's the kind of volatility we're dealing with at this stage. But we don't have a particular answer to the number where the downward stands right now. And Silgi, the other question was, I'm sorry.
If we have to shut down again, what will be the threshold and process?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We think about that a lot. What we will be doing is tracking COVID in the area and particularly community spread, and that will probably be the factor, much like the factor was in March. Maud was worried about community spread and was worried about the college's impact on the health infrastructure here in Berkshire County. So that will probably be the determining factor. I do have some optimistic news in that sense. Deb and I meet regularly with the folks from Berkshire Health System, and they are actually quite confident about their ability to deal with whether you call it another surge or reoccurrence of COVID. So that was good news that we heard, so it's good to know that the infrastructure in this county is solid.
Great. So we're going to switch over now to answer some of the live questions. So we're just going to go in the order that folks raise their hands, and I know some of you have been raised for a while. We'll start with David Morrison. So David, we're going to unmute you and go for it whenever you're ready. David, if you're still here, we can't hear you. So if you're muted, please make sure you unmute yourself. Okay, David might have hopped off, so we'll get back to you, David. Let's move on to Jerry Byers. Jerry, if you're on the call, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Sorry, I think I did an accidental raise hand.
Okay, no problem. Okay, is that you? Is that Jerry?
Yeah.
Okay, so Jerry, we're gonna move on then. If you think of anything, let us know. That's okay. Meg Basong, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, we sort of struck a glancing blow at this question, but totally self-focused. This question is about childcare. And, I'm reflecting on the email that went out from our own children's center about limited hours, limited capacity, that it may be quite some time before people expecting to start August 31st could have childcare. And so I just would like to hear something a little bit more specific for folks who have, especially children who can't be occupied during the day, like a baby, and who have student-facing jobs. It's one thing with something like this, I can mute, I can do like email work, but with student-facing work, that's not easily disrupted by, childcare. So could we get maybe a more specific answer to that question?
So Meg, this is going to be dissatisfying to you. I'm going to set expectations up front. Carrie is working very hard at putting together a plan to open the Children's Center. As you know, that's going to be very difficult work given COVID. Some of the limitations, the state has provided some guidelines to us. Not everything is not in place yet. One of them is limitations on sizes of classrooms. So certain of our classrooms, like the 4-year-old program, is going to be limited in terms of the state requirements of under 10. In addition, we have staff at the Children's Center that fit into the at-risk category, so she'll be down staff during this time. I think we can anticipate about 50% capacity at first. The plan is to open up the Children's Center during the summer. And learn at a limited capacity and possibly limited hours. So it's not going to, it won't start at 8 o'clock till 5:30 as it is now. And we're going to learn as we go and hopefully increase the capacity as we go. Part of what we're going to do is ask parents about their need. And again, this gets back to the community commitment. And hopefully there'll be parents out there who don't need the full 9.5 hours of care every single day. And to the extent people can get by with a little less care, we're hopeful that we can meet the needs of almost everyone. Faculty and staff get priority, so it's unlikely we'll be able to provide care to community and alumni. There was a question on the list that we didn't get to that asked about whether faculty would continue to get the priority over staff. And I'm glad someone asked that question because it gives me the opportunity to dispel that misconception. Faculty do not get priority over staff. All our employees get the same priority. There is a priority for siblings. If you already have someone in the center, you get a little priority over someone who doesn't already have a child doesn't have a sibling in the center. But staff and faculty are treated equally when it comes to the use of the center. So maybe we're going to try our best to provide as much care to as many children as we possibly can, given the limitations by the state and by our own staffing.
Thanks, Fred. I just want to see if maybe David Morrison, who had raised his hand earlier, is back. David, if you're out there, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. And I also wanted to let folks know that if you have any last minute questions before we go at 4, the Q&A tool and the raise hand tool are both available to you.
Solgi, can I just build on the childcare piece of things and just say, once again, this is going to be a tenet of our work plan that we deal with individual departments. I think not only childcare, but by no means do we have our head in the sand with respect to public schools or school systems and how they're going to be operating, and recognize that we'll need to work with departmental managers and supervisors to think through how do you manage something that may not look like it has in the past with disrupted schedules and other things. So by no means are we building a plan that says we anticipate schools to be open, and then if they're not open, we're going to throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, we give up. So we're going to be working extensively with these work plans to sort of tease out those issues, develop a set of guidelines and policies that ensure that people can be present at work, but also be present and care for family and children and those kinds of things. So just want to highlight not only the childcare aspect of things, but we're also being cognizant. We're also working with community partners to think about how do we think differently about some of those programs that might exist in the community that can be a support system for those type of situations, especially for our essential staff.
Great. So I think the questions through the Q&A and the raise hand tool have stopped. So I'll just reiterate that this session has been recorded and will be pushed out very soon, if not tonight, tomorrow at some point, and be available online for about a week. You didn't want to do too long just because things can change very quickly, as we all know. So that'll be available. And also this working group is always open to feedback and questions even after this session. So the names of everybody on this session were shared out by Danielle in her invitation email. We're always happy to hear from you. Oh, okay, there's one more hand, so let's take this final question and then we will let everybody get on with their day. So Judy Willette, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, excuse me, I'm sorry, I got to the meeting late. I was on a different call. I missed the beginning, and I was wondering if when the kids come back, I'm assuming they'll come back, and I'm sorry I missed this earlier, but if the kids come back and there's a problem in one of the dorms, like an outbreak, like in Mission Park with 300 beds or Horn Hall with 60 beds, what is the protocol? Are we gonna disperse again and everybody go back home? I mean, what is the protocol going to be for that situation?
Deb, you want to take that one to start?
Yeah, trying to unmute myself. So everyone that we test who is positive will be immediately isolated, and then the contacts will be traced. All the contacts, according to the new DPH rules, will then be tested and either quarantined or isolated. So, and we will have a robust testing program. So we are hoping to avoid the situation where we have numerous people infected at once. We're hoping to do a surveillance program so that we identify the positives early on, get them isolated, get the contacts quarantined, so that we don't run into that exact situation.
And Judy, we're setting aside, we don't know exactly how many students will come back to campus. We suspect it won't be 100%. The goal is to provide every student with a single room. They won't have single-use bathrooms. And we are setting aside residence halls for, as Deb just indicated, both for students we have to isolate and students we have to quarantine. And depending on how many students choose to come back, and they will tell us, the deadline for telling us that is July 10th. We're also looking at procuring additional space for students in the community. So we believe we'll have enough capacity to house our students, plus provide for the spaces Deb just mentioned with respect to quarantine and isolation.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's just a worry because, we're there during the day and they're at classes or whatever they do, but at night they definitely congregate. And I don't mean to be a skeptic, but I'm fearing the worst here.
Yeah, Judy, I understand your point of view. And, part of this thing we talked about before you got on the call, which is community commitment to do the best we can to abide by the rules we're going to put in place. I agree. It's unlikely the students, if you walk down Hoxie Street, are going to be a 100% compliance. But I also find that in the community when I get around. I don't walk around too much, but when I do, there are people that are not complying in the community. So I think this is really a challenge for all of us to increase our compliance. And it's just a couple of simple things. Wear a mask when you're out in public, keep 6 foot away from somebody else, and wash your hands a lot. It sounds hard, but it's actually pretty simple.
Yeah, it's not that hard. It's pretty easy. Thank you.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everybody who participated. When I took a quick look earlier, it looked like we're nearing 360. So I think this is just a great group of folks who were on the call. Thanks for all the terrific questions that were submitted in advance and during the session. And again, if you have any questions or comments we didn't get to, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the subcommittee heads or the chairs or Danielle. We're eager to hear from you. And thank you again. Have a great afternoon.